You're 31 years old and you can hold a secret the way other people hold their breath, past the point where it's comfortable, past the point where anyone would blame you for letting it go, into the territory where the holding becomes its own kind of permanent. That's the skill they don't put in the job description for a White House personal secretary. They list typing speed and shorthand proficiency and discretion is the word they use when what they mean is this: the capacity to sit in a chair 12 feet from the most surveilled office in the world and know things and carry them without the weight showing on your face. You've been doing this for 4 years. You're not the policy advisor. You're not the counsel. You're not the person whose name appears in the briefings or the histories or the newspaper accounts of what was decided and when. You're the person outside the door. You manage the schedule. You handle the correspondence routing. You hold the information that flows through the office the way the office holds air. Necessarily, invisibly, without anyone stopping to notice it's happening. Everyone wants to know what's on the tape. You already know. That's not an advantage. That's a trap that's been closing around you for 22 months and is now, in November of 1973, shut. The White House recording system had been running since 1971. This was not a secret among the senior staff. It was a known infrastructure, something you were aware of and did not discuss, the way you were aware of many things and did not discuss them, because the job was built on the architecture of appropriate silence. You knew which conversations were captured and which rooms were covered. You knew the tapes were stored and cataloged and that their existence was, until the summer of 1973, a matter known only to a small number of people inside the building. Then, the summer of 1973 happened, and the existence of the system became known to a considerably larger number of people, and the tapes went from being an administrative infrastructure to being the central question of the most significant political crisis in the country's modern history, and you were still 12 feet from the door with your stenopad and your shorthand and your 4 years of practiced structural silence. The rules hadn't changed, only what was at stake if you broke them. Rule 1. What passes through this office is not yours. The correspondence, the schedules, the conversations you overhear through the door, the fragments of information that accumulate over 4 years in the memory of a person who sits close enough to power to catch its secondary radiation, none of it belongs to you. You are a relay. A trusted relay, yes. A valued relay, certainly. But the information moves through you. It does not stop with you. Rule 2. Discretion is not silence. Discretion is knowing the difference between what is asked of you and what is asked of the office. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes they are not. You navigate the gap with the same stillness you bring to the stenopad. You don't telegraph the navigation. Rule 3. The schedule is the job. Everything else is context. You manage what comes in and what goes out, and when the door opens and when it doesn't. And that management is what the office runs on. And you do it with professional precision that has nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with the specific competence you've spent 4 years building. Rule 4. You don't finish chains you aren't handed the end of. There are things you know partial versions of. Conversations that started before you entered a room and continued after you left. Decisions that reached your desk as completed facts without their antecedents. You carry the fragment. You don't construct the rest of the chain. That construction is not your job. Rule 4 was working fine until the morning of November 14th, 1973, when you walked into a room 30 seconds too early and the tape was running and two men were talking and the chain handed itself to you whether you wanted it or not. The dictaphone on your desk was standard White House issue. Compact, gray, reliable in the specific way of equipment procured through institutional channels. Not elegant, but consistent. You used it for correspondence drafts, scheduling notes, the occasional memo that needed to capture language precisely before the language got refined through the drafting process into something more careful and less accurate. You'd had the same model for 3 years. It sat on the right side of the desk, beside the phone, in the position your hand reached for automatically when something needed recording and your stenopad wasn't open. After November 14th, you started a new stenopad. The old one had nothing relevant in it. This wasn't about evidence. It wasn't a precaution you could have articulated if someone had asked you to. It was something the body does when it needs to mark a line between before and after and doesn't have another mechanism available. The old pad went into the desk drawer. The new one went on the desk surface. Your hand reached for it automatically in subsequent meetings. It became the object you held when you didn't know what else to do with your hands. That's the thing about a physical habit in a body carrying something it doesn't know how to hold. The hands find their way to something familiar. The familiar thing accumulates the weight of what the hands are carrying. By January, the new stenopad had become something other than a work tool. It had become the object your hands understood as the place where the weight lived. The room was the Roosevelt Room. You'd been in it hundreds of times. A working room, wood paneling, the portrait of Theodore Roosevelt above the fireplace, a conference table long enough that the people at either end couldn't hear each other without raising their voices. You knew its acoustics the way you knew every room you worked adjacent to, professionally, involuntarily, as a function of 4 years of being paid to be aware of things. You'd gone in to retrieve a folder. Routine retrieval. The kind of errand that happens a dozen times a day without notation in anyone's memory because it's just the administrative tissue the building runs on. Someone needs a document, you get the document, the errand vanishes into the general forward motion of the office. The door opened quietly. It always did. You'd never developed the habit of announcing yourself in working rooms, because working rooms in the West Wing were usually empty when you needed them and occupied when you were invited into them, and the combination of those two things had produced, over 4 years, a behavioral pattern that did not include pausing at the threshold. Two men were at the far end of the table. Their backs were mostly to you. The tape unit in the room's infrastructure was active. You knew the indicator, a small telltale on the wall panel that you'd learned to read automatically the way you read everything in the building, adding it to the background of known facts without deciding to. You stood inside the doorway for 11 seconds. This is the number you've verified in the only way available to you. By reconstructing the conversation against what you know of the system's timing, running the length of what you heard against the speed at which you registered it, arriving at 11 seconds as the interval between the door opening and the door closing again. You're aware this is not scientific. It's the precision available to you, and you've worked with it for 22 months. What you heard in 11 seconds was enough to complete the chain. Not everything, not the full architecture, but the load-bearing piece, the piece that, once you have it, allows the rest of the structure to be read for what it is rather than what it was presented as. The 11 seconds told you what the 18.5 minutes contained. Not the words, the fact, the specific, actionable fact of what had been decided and when and by whose direct instruction. You backed out of the doorway. You closed the door quietly. You went to your desk and you opened the new stenopad and you wrote shorthand for 4 hours without stopping. And the shorthand was meeting notes and correspondence drafts and scheduling confirmations, and none of it was about what you'd heard, and the writing was what your hands did when what you'd heard was trying to become a thought you finished. You didn't let yourself finish it. Not that day. That's the moment. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a decision made in a lit room with the weight of history visible in the air around it. A folder that stayed where it was. 11 seconds. A door closing quietly. 9:47 in the morning on a Thursday in November. The most ordinary possible container for the most permanently consequential thing you'd ever carry. The subpoena for the tapes came in July. The Saturday Night Massacre was in October. The gap, the 18.5 minutes, became public in November. You followed the reporting with the professional attention of someone whose job required awareness of developments adjacent to the office, and with the private attention of someone who knew what the gap contained and was watching the official account of its origins accumulate in the public record with the discomfort of a person who can see exactly where the account is wrong and cannot say so, and has not decided whether the inability to say so is institutional or personal or both. The official explanation arrived in late November. An accidental erasure, a stretch, a foot pedal held too long against an inadvertent recording. The demonstration photograph, the physical position required to produce the accident. You looked at the photograph in the newspaper at your kitchen table on a Saturday morning with coffee going cold, and you thought about 11 seconds in a doorway and the specific quality of something constructed to look like an accident. You finished your coffee. You washed the cup. You did not think about it further in a way that was visible externally. Internally, you'd been running two versions of November 14th simultaneously for 22 months. The version in which you retrieved the folder and the room was empty and the errand disappeared into the building's forward motion, and the version that actually happened. They ran in parallel the way an operator maintains two frequencies, without either one collapsing into the other, without the maintenance showing on your face. His name was Daniel, 26 years old when he joined the staff, 18 months before the crisis broke publicly. Georgetown law degree, the specific combination of intelligence and political instinct that the West Wing attracted in quantity. Young men who had identified power as the relevant variable and oriented themselves toward it with precision. He was good at his job. He was also in the way of very smart young people not yet tested by something they can't manage through intelligence alone, slightly too confident in his read of the situation. He'd started asking you questions in September, not about the tapes directly, about the office, about the chain of documentation, about what a personal secretary in your position would or wouldn't be aware of regarding the recording system's operation. The questions were careful. They were framed as professional curiosity, the reasonable information gathering of a staff member trying to understand the full operational picture. You answered what you could answer. You didn't answer what you couldn't. You maintained Rule 2. Discretion is not silence, with the precision of 4 years of practice and the additional precision of someone who understood that Daniel's questions were not entirely about what he was asking. He had a job offer from a law firm in October, Colson and Merritt, DC office, the kind of placement that meant the next decade was planned if he wanted it. He mentioned it on a Tuesday afternoon when you were both waiting for the elevator. He said he was thinking about it. He said the timing was complicated. He looked at you when he said the timing was complicated. You asked what kind of timing he meant. He said he wasn't sure yet whether he was in the kind of situation where leaving felt like the right thing or the wrong thing to do. You understood what he was asking, not directly, not in language that committed him to having asked it, but in the space beneath the language where the real question was sitting. He was asking whether you knew what you knew. He was asking whether, if you knew what you knew, staying was the thing that protected you or the thing that exposed you. He was asking because he'd been watching you for 3 months and he thought you might have the answer. You told him the elevator was coming. He nodded. The elevator arrived. You both got in. He got out at the third floor. You continued to the second. The question went with you. It sat in the same internal space as the 11 seconds and the parallel versions and the stenopad on the desk. You don't feel relief after the elevator. Relief would mean the danger had passed. The danger doesn't pass when you avoid naming it. It just continues without a name. The ticking clock in November of 1973 was the investigation itself. The special prosecutor had the tapes. The court had ordered their production. The White House had produced them, the subpoenaed tapes, in the order specified. And then the gap had surfaced in the technical analysis, and the question of what had been there before it wasn't there anymore was now a formal legal question with institutional apparatus and the specific momentum of a process that doesn't stop once it identifies the shape of what's missing. What the investigation didn't have was a witness to what the gap contained. You were the witness to what the gap contained. This is the clock nobody could see running externally. The internal clock, the interval between the moment you understood what you were and the moment that understanding became unavoidable to act on. 22 months since November 14th, the gap was public, the official explanation was in the record, and you were still at the desk, stenopad in reach. The question the clock was running toward was not whether to come forward. You'd examined that from enough angles to understand it wasn't actually the question. The real question was simpler and worse. Was the information yours to disclose? The relay doesn't claim the river. Rule 1 said the information moving through this office was not yours. But Rule 1 didn't have an exception for the category of information that describes a crime. You'd been working on that gap for 22 months without arriving. Daniel took the law firm offer in December. He gave notice on a Wednesday. He stopped by your desk on his last day with the directness of someone who has made a decision and is now operating from the clarity that comes after choosing. He said he thought you were the most capable person he'd encountered in 2 years in the building. He said it without the performative warmth of a young staffer complimenting a senior colleague. He meant it as the specific acknowledgement of someone who had spent 3 months watching how you worked under pressure he could see and pressure he couldn't quite identify. You thanked him. He paused. He was going to say something else. You watched him arrive at the decision not to. The small, visible adjustment of a person choosing the length of the conversation. He held out his hand. You shook it. He left. He sent a Christmas card that year, and the year after, and for 12 years after that. The cards were warm and brief, and talked about the firm and the work and occasional life updates that arrived with the reliable cadence of someone maintaining a connection without requiring it to carry more than it could hold. Not one of them mentioned November 14th. Not one mentioned the elevator. Some agreements hold better when they're never made explicit. You'd learned this in 4 years of the job and applied it to everything after without deciding to. The second stenopad lasted until March of 1974. You started a third one then, the same brand, the same size, the same spiral binding that your hand had reached for automatically across 4 years and would continue to reach for because the body doesn't revise its habits to match the changed conditions of the life it's carrying them in. The second pad went into the desk drawer with the first. Both of them were full of meeting notes and correspondence drafts and scheduling confirmations. Neither of them contained what you knew. What you knew lived where it had always lived, the internal record, the version maintained in the part of you that processes things in shorthand at the speed of events without deciding to, that logs everything and flags nothing, because flagging requires a destination and you hadn't identified a destination that didn't cost something you weren't sure you had the right to spend. You drove to work, you parked, you went to your desk. The stenopad was where you'd left it. The resignation was August 1974. You watched it in the break room with 11 other people, and the room had the quality all rooms have when something large is happening through a screen. The peculiar double distance of being present to the event and present to the watching of it simultaneously. Two removes from the thing itself. The room was quiet. People held their coffee. The machinery was completing a sequence, and the record would show what the record would show. You finished your coffee. You went back to your desk. You opened the stenopad. Nobody ever asked you directly, not in the formal sense, not with a subpoena or a deposition notice or a request carrying the legal structure's weight behind it. You were interviewed once, briefly, by a staff investigator who asked about your general knowledge of the recording system and your duties regarding document management and your awareness of the schedule on the day in question. You answered accurately. Everything you said was true. None of the questions asked what you were aware of regarding the Roosevelt Room at 9:47 on a November morning, and you had developed, over 22 months, the discipline not to add information to a container that hadn't been shaped to receive it. The investigator thanked you. You went back to your desk. The stenopad was where you'd left it. That's the most unsettling thing about the machinery of inquiry. It's only as precise as the questions it thinks to ask. You left in January of 1975. Not dramatically. The end of an administration is the end of a particular class of employment, and the people within it move to the next things their lives have prepared them for. You moved accordingly. A position at a smaller firm outside DC, in a city where the buildings didn't remind you of a particular route, driven 4 years in the same direction. The work was analogous but lighter in the specific way that work is lighter when it's not being conducted 12 feet from the most consequential door in the country. The stenopads came with you. Both of them. They went into a box with other personal items from the desk, and the box went into your car, and the car drove out of Washington on a February morning with the city in the rear view, looking the way it always looked from the approach. Composed, organized, projecting the idea about governing that it was built to project. You didn't look at the pads in the new city. They went on a shelf and stayed there the way objects stay when their function has concluded, but their weight hasn't resolved. You knew what was in them. You knew what wasn't. The gap between those two things was the same gap it had always been, just in a different city, on a different shelf, in a life running forward the way lives do regardless of what they're carrying. Daniel made partner in 1981. You read it in a legal publication that arrived through a routing list you'd been added to at some point without remembering why. You read the notice twice. You thought about an elevator, and a question held in the space below language and a hand extended on a last day. His card that Christmas had a line at the bottom different from the previous 7 years of cards. He said he thought about the building sometimes. He said he hoped you were well in the way people say it when they mean something more specific and have decided not to make that specificity the content of a card. He said the work felt meaningful in ways he hadn't expected. He said nothing about the elevator. You wrote back about the new city and a trip you'd taken that fall. You said the work was good, The correspondence continued. It maintained the temperature it had always maintained, warm enough to be real, bounded enough to be safe, shaped around the 11 seconds the way two people can shape a years-long conversation around a room neither of them names. Some agreements hold better when they're never made explicit. You'd learned this in 4 years of the job and applied it to everything after without deciding to. They kept asking, in the general sense of the public record asking, what had been in the gap. The investigations produced their conclusions. The histories were written. The participants gave their accounts in the order they became available to give them, and the accounts formed the record. And the record became the version, and the version calcified into the thing referred to when the events were referred to. You gave one interview, 1989, a historian writing a comprehensive account of the period. You talked about the job, the schedule management, the correspondence routing, the 4 years of work adjacent to an administration during a period of considerable stress. You talked about discretion. You talked about what it meant to be the person outside the door. He asked what you remembered most clearly about the period. You said you remembered the quality of the work, the precision it required, the specific discipline of maintaining the function of the office under conditions that made the function genuinely difficult. You said you'd learned more about institutional machinery during those years than at any other point in your professional life. You said it had taught you that the machinery runs on the people inside it in ways those people rarely fully understand while they're there. He asked if there was anything you wished you'd done differently. The light in the room was afternoon light, coming at the angle that meant the day was completing itself. You thought about 11 seconds and a door closing quietly, and a new stenopad and a question held in an elevator, and 12 years of Christmas cards moving between two people in parallel around a room, neither of them named. You said you thought everyone who worked closely with power for any significant period ended up carrying things that didn't have a clean way out, that the carrying was part of the job in ways the job description didn't cover, that you'd made peace with most of what you carried, that peace and resolution were different things, and you'd learned not to confuse them. He wrote that down. The stenopads are on the shelf, a different shelf now. You've moved twice since the first apartment after Washington, and the box came with you both times because you packed it yourself and you knew which box it was. The pads contain 4 months of the administrative record of a White House office during the most consequential political crisis of the post-war era. They contain no mention of a Roosevelt Room, or a folder, or 11 seconds, or two men at the far end of a conference table with the tape indicator lit. What they contain is the negative space of what you know. The record of everything you processed and documented during those months is also, by what it doesn't contain, the record of the one thing you processed and didn't document. The shape of the gap is visible in the gap's absence. That's what you've been keeping in a spiral-bound notebook on whatever shelf the next years of your life provided. Not evidence, not confession, just the outline of the one thing that didn't make it into the log. The way the shape of a body leaves its impression in a bed after the person has gotten up and gone, and the sheets have settled back toward each other but haven't fully closed. Daniel retired in 2003. His last card said he was looking forward to the slower pace. He said it had been a long run. He said he was grateful, in ways he didn't fully have language for the people who had understood what he was trying to do in the early years, even when he hadn't articulated it clearly. He said he thought about the elevator sometimes. That was the first time either of you mentioned it. You wrote back that you thought about it too, that you'd thought about it more than you expected to across all the years between, that the question he'd been asking in it was one you'd spent a long time trying to answer and had eventually understood was not a question with a final answer, only a question you kept carrying into the next year and the year after that. He wrote back once more, 2 sentences. He said he thought the carrying was probably the honest thing. He said he was glad you were both still around to do it. That was the last card. The stenopad is on the shelf. The internal log is still running. Your hands still reach for the pad automatically. Even now, even in a life where there are no meetings to document and no schedules to maintain, and no door outside which you are the person who manages what comes in and goes out. The reaching is just what the hands do. Some reflexes survive everything.